Hello. Okay, it's a couple of hours after recording the previous video. It's the same day, even though I look completely different. Because in those couple of hours I shaved, showered, and changed. But believe me, it is the same day. So I'm going to talk about the rest of part 3 of Words of Radiance, which I didn't get to talk about last time because there's so much to say about this particular part of the book. So the first thing I want to talk about here is lift. So there's a single chapter, which is maybe the longest chapter we've had so far in all of the Stormlight Archive. It's a very long chapter from the perspective of a new character named Lift. Now, full disclosure, I do know, and I guess this can be considered a spoiler, I do know that Lift is a major character going forward. I do know that I know nothing but her name. I didn't know she was a child. I honestly didn't even know her gender. I'd just seen the name Lift thrown around as a major character in the Stormlight Archive. So when this chapter started, I did go into it with the knowledge that this wasn't like a one-off intermission like a lot of them are, where it's just like, oh, here's some fun world building with like a random one-off character. I did know that I should pay special attention to this one because she was going to be important. Um, so that did sort of color my perception of the chapter, but I think even if I hadn't known that, this chapter would have really stuck out to me as incredibly rich in stuff to talk about. So, let's get to it. First of all, Lift is a surge binder. She's a surge binder. Apparently, her kind of surge binding is called edge dancing. I believe that's what her spren Windle said. She calls Windle a Voidbringer, which is very cute. I like that so far all of the surge binders we've met have very different relationships with their spren, and their spren also have very different levels of like human behavior. Like Pattern is a total alien still, doesn't get anything. Whereas on the other side, obviously, Syl is just like a fully developed person. Um, and Windle is sort of in between those two extremes, I feel. Anyway, so Windle mentions that Lift was chosen for him. So unlike Syl, who actively chose Kaladin, Windle was essentially assigned to Lift against his will by, he doesn't seem to really mind, but you know, by something called the Ring. And he also refers to the Night Watcher as our mother. So whatever kind of spren he is, it's the kind of spren that's closely tied to the Night Watcher. And considering Windle's whole like plant thing, and the fact that he gives Lift, among other things, the power to regrow things and grow things in general, I think that matches up with my previous assumption that I made in a previous video, that the Night Watcher is associated with cultivation. That the Night Watcher is like a major cultivation spren, just like how the Stormfather is a major honor spren. So that's just some world building that I think I've managed to work out here. But as for Lift herself, I think she's already my new favorite character. I really like Lift. I love the way she speaks. I love the way she uses the word awesomeness to describe her powers. She is just incredibly likable and cute and adorable. And also, if you've ever read the incredibly good webcomic Unsounded, the main character of that webcomic is a girl named Seti Frumagem, or Seta, or Set. I don't know how to pronounce. But Lift is so similar to that character who I love that, like, basically from the moment she started talking, I was like, what? This is, I know this character. I've read so much of this character in that comic. What is this? So I'm not saying that Brandon Sanderson plagiarized that comic. That would be an insane thing to claim. I think he just sort of ended up on a really similar trope of a character, which I really enjoy. I'm definitely not complaining about that. I'm always happy to see more of that character, even if it's technically a different character. So, there's also the character of Darkness. Now, Darkness is, as far as I can tell, the person who, in an earlier intermission, killed the old cobbler who was using surge binding to heal people. And Darkness is interesting. So Darkness is obviously himself a surge binder, but whatever kind of spren he's bonded to clearly has like a thing about laws, because that doesn't seem like it's just his personal ideology. I feel like it's like the ideology that powers the kind of surge binding that he does, kind of like how protecting others and being an honorable person and a hero powers Kaladins, or how lies power Shalans. I get the feeling from the way Darkness behaves that laws power him, and that's where he gets his power, because he is willing to sacrifice his mission, which clearly he cares about a lot, just because it's technically no longer legal for him to fulfill it by the laws of the local country. Like, and that would be a really weird thing to care about unless it was like a metaphysical importance being granted to the idea of laws. So I'm curious what the hell Darkness's deal is. He seems to think that Surge Binders are going to bring back the Desolations and Voidbringers, whereas I'm under the impression that the reason the Surge Binders are coming back is because the Desolation and Voidbringers are coming back. So we'll see what the actual causal relationship there is. Does Darkness have it wrong? Or do some of the other characters who've hinted the opposite have it wrong? We'll see. What else happens in this chapter? Right, we also learn a lot about a new culture, which is a really weird culture, but I really like it. I can't remember its name right now. Azir? Was it Azir? I think it was Azir. Yeah, that culture is really fascinating to me, and it's also really fascinating how Seth's actions have impacted their culture, because they're in this weird position now where usually being the prime is incredibly desirable, but now, because Seth has been killing rulers around the world, being the prime is now something that no one wants to be. And Lift's friend becomes prime at the end because she resurrected him, and the clerks and the viziers believe that his resurrection means that he's essentially immortal and therefore won't be killed by Seth. And the irony is, they're going to be proven right in that he probably won't be killed by Seth like the previous primes, but not because of his powers, but because Seth is now free from his vows, I think. I'm still not actually 100% sure that he is, but the vibe I get from the Seth chapter, which comes right after this, is that Seth is no longer going to obey, the person who holds his Oathstone. Because as far as I can tell, the Oathstone doesn't actually have any magical power to compel him. It's just a cultural tradition, basically. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think I am. I think the Oathstone is just a rock. I don't think it's magic. So I think Seth is like free now, and that means that we have no way of knowing what the hell he's gonna do. So one other thing that happens during the lift chapter is that she passes by a bunch of, I can't remember if they're statues or paintings or tapestries of the 10 heralds. And one of the heralds is missing a face. And Lift thinks this is weird. Lift is like, what? Why? Why would that be a thing? And that woke up a memory inside me, so I went back to the first book, the very first chapter where Seth kills Gavilar, and I found the thing that it was reminding me of, which is that in that chapter, Seth, in the palace, in Gavilar's palace in Kholinar, Seth finds like a line of statues of all the 10 heralds, and one of them, specifically Shalash, is missing a face. And what's interesting to me about this is that both Seth and Lift are confused by this. Here it doesn't say that it's Shalash, but I'm going to assume it's Shalash because I'm going to assume these things are connected. And both Seth and Lift are confused by this, which means that this isn't like a universal, like, cultural thing. It's not like what's being hinted at here isn't the idea that, oh, everyone knows that this herald is portrayed without a face for some reason. What's being hinted at here is that for some reason, depictions of this herald, who normally has a face, are losing their faces. At least that's how I'm interpreting that. So, that's interesting. That's really interesting. I'm also really fascinated about Lift's unique power, which, and by that I don't mean her actual surge binding powers. I mean the fact that she doesn't actually draw stormlight out of the environment. She metabolizes food directly into stormlight. And this is something that darkness is clearly totally unprepared for. So I think this might be like a completely unique thing that no one else but her can do. And it clearly has something to do with her wish from the Night Watcher. I don't know what that wish is. I can't even begin to guess, but it's implied in Wendell's dialogue that she made a wish from the Night Watcher, and that either what the Night Watcher gave her, or maybe what the Night Watcher took away, is responsible for this ability of hers to turn food into stormlight. Yeah, so that's all my thoughts on Lift, I think. Now, I want to talk briefly about the Parshendi. So, the Parshendi are clearly going down a very dark path. I predicted at the end of the previous book that the Parshendi are not going to be the main antagonists of the Stormlight Archive. I still think that, but I think they're going to be significantly more of an antagonistic force than I anticipated. Because clearly they've fallen under, I almost said Ruin's influence. Wrong series. They've fallen under Odium's influence. But in a way that's really similar to how the Khandra fell under Ruin's influence. So or the Inquisitors. So there's definitely like similarities with how these deities work across the Cosmere, which makes sense because I'm pretty sure that all of these, that like Ruin and Preservation are the same kind of thing as Honor, Cultivation, and Odium. Yeah, so the Parshendi have like pretty thoroughly fallen under Odium's control now, except for a pretty large group which ran away. And I'm guessing that they're going to get to the war camps and warn the humans, or try to. I don't think they'll succeed because I feel like this book is really, really building up towards the Parshendi's plan succeeding. And I did predict what the Parshendi's plan was going to be before Eshonai said it. She did say it at the end of this part, but I did predict it like many chapters before that, which is that they're waiting for the weeping, for the humans to be off their guard and not expect a high storm, and then they're going to produce a high storm using their storm forms and wipe out all the humans. So obviously that's not going to happen. Like, obviously some humans are going to survive, but I do expect that this book is going to go extremely poorly for the Alethi. Like, to the point where I don't know if they're going to be able to even keep fighting on the Shattered Plains after this, because this is a really, really dangerous plan that the Parshendi have right now. Speaking of Parshendi, Shen. Shen is interesting to me because Shen starts talking to Kaladin in this book, and he's like, oh, why don't I have a spear? Am I a slave? And Kaladin's like, oh, what? No, you're not. Here, have a spear. Dalinar said it's okay. And then Shen leaves at the end. And there's several things that I find fascinating about this. One, I don't think Shen ever spoke in the entire first book. Like, he spoke, but I think he didn't, like, we didn't have actual quotes from him in the book. I think every time he spoke, it would just be sort of like a line, like Kaladin would think, like, oh, Shen almost never speaks, and when he does, it's just to say yes or no or whatever. But, like, we never actually had dialogue from Shen on the page, I think, until this book. Also, I shouldn't be calling him Shen. We found out that he has a different name, but I didn't write that name down here in my notes. Unfortunate. Yeah. So I'm going to switch to calling him the proper name once I figure out what that name is in future videos. But just know that I have noticed that that Shen is not his name. I just cannot remember his actual name. So yeah, I think it's pretty clear that Shen is not actually a Parshman. Shen is one of the Parshendi dull form spies. Because from what Eshonai seems to say about the Parshmen or slave forms as they're called, don't really have free will. Like, I don't think a Parshman could have the thoughts and desires that Shen expresses in this part. And certainly couldn't just leave like Shen does at the end here. I think that's proof that Shen is Parshendi, not Parshman. And we do know that they have dull form spies hidden among the Parshmen. So I'm wondering what Shen is doing now. Like, where is he going? Is he going to report back to the main Parshendi force? Is he going to stop the Parshendi, to sabotage them? I don't know. I'm gonna keep an eye out for what he's doing going forward. What else? What else is there for me to say? Oh, right. Now there's several, like, random things I noticed that feel relevant throughout this chapter. So first of all, Shallan's powers. When she first creates the image of Veil, I believe that's when it is, like when she first disguises herself as Veil. Was that when it was? Or when she disguised herself as, like, a hotter version of herself? I can't remember, but either way, she's in a carriage with Pattern. And she experiments with her powers, and she creates an external illusion. She creates, like, a puppet sitting across from her. And then, to dispel that puppet, she breathes in the stormlight that she exhaled to create the puppet, and the stormlight goes back into her. And, like, that's breath. That's how breath works in Warbreaker. I'm not saying this is necessarily a connection, but since I do know that these stories are connected, I am wondering if I've caught on to something here. Is the stuff that happens in Warbreaker just like a kind of surge binding? Is breath just stormlight? No, that doesn't sound right, because breath, like, you're born with a single breath and you can lose it forever, and it's not surge binding, but maybe there's a connection. maybe the magic systems of these two worlds are more interlinked. And speaking of connections to other worlds, one thing we found out in this section is that aluminum is a material that can only be soulcast. It doesn't exist otherwise. The only way to have aluminum in this world is to soulcast it. And that's really interesting, because aluminum is also a special, different metal that's super rare and valuable, and has like a weird, unique power in Mistborn. Is that also a connection? Is aluminum a connection? I don't know, but maybe. What other thing happened here that sort of made my brain go boink? There was definitely at least a couple more thoughts I had. Right, Hoyd, when talking to Shallan, he asks her, why are axe hounds called axe hounds? And she's like, what do you mean? And he's like, well, I know what an axe is, but what the hell do you think a hound is? And that's actually a thought I had. Like, before that chapter, I'd actually had the thought, like, as far as I can tell, axe hounds are the only kind of dog that exists in this world. Like, they're the replacement for dogs. So where does the word hound come from if there's no dogs for them to refer to? And I thought that was just like kind of Brandon just giving a name without thinking about whether that name could reasonably exist within the setting, because like that's totally like I do that all the time when naming fantasy things. Like, I would name something an axe hound without thinking about whether there are dogs in the setting. Definitely, that could easily happen. But no, it's actually relevant. It's a hint. So, between that and the fact that Shinovar, is Shinovar the name of the country Seth is from? I know the people are Shin, but I think the place is Shinovar. So, between that and the fact that Shinovar has like normal Earth environments and also animals like birds, like chickens, and also parrots, which they still call chickens because to them all birds are chickens, which is very funny, because that's obviously a parrot that appears in these chapters. Anyway, yeah, so the fact that Shinovar has like normal Earth geology and zoology, and the fact that Hoyd hints at the idea that axe hounds are named hounds after dogs, which don't exist, that's making me pretty certain that this world, like, I'm pretty sure that the entirety of Roshar used to be a much more normal Earth-like planet, which didn't even occur to me. Like, my assumption this whole time was that Roshar was just naturally like this. It didn't occur to me that it might be more like the setting of Mistborn than I thought, because the setting of Mistborn, it's clear from the get-go that the setting of Mistborn in Era 1 is weird and different for supernatural reasons that aren't naturally occurring. Like, it's like you're immediately like, oh, this world wasn't always like this. The book doesn't really hide that fact from you. But here, I was very much under the impression that the world was always like this. That the fact that there's no soil, the fact that all the animals are crustaceans, the fact that there's the high storms, I thought these were all naturally occurring things. But maybe not. And the other interesting thing I noticed is Navani's experiment with the two platforms that are like linked together, the two Fabrial platforms, where if you lift one, the other one goes down and vice versa, without them actually touching each other or being in any kind of direct contact. That isn't quite, but reminds me of the concept of quantum entanglement. Specifically because that one chapter in the first book seemed to suggest that spren have quantum qualities. And the fact that, so like, is this magic system based on like quantum mechanics? Is that the inspiration for this book's magic system? Because if so, that's crazy. That's an incredibly cool idea. I hope that's the case. I hope we get more of that as we go on. I hope we get more like crazy quantum physics stuff going on in this in this setting. Speaking of which, there's also a scene early on where Adeline witnesses a bunch of people soul casting, what's the word? Ardents, a bunch of soul casting ardents. And when they soul cast to they essentially seem to turn air into stone, from what I can tell. And there's like the air pulls inward. There's an implosion of air as that's happening. And Adeline thinks, why did that happen? Shouldn't it be blown outward by the rock displacing it? And that was a really interesting moment for me, because yeah, Adeline probably doesn't know how soul casting works. Not least because he's a man and therefore can't read, so like, he probably doesn't know anything about anything in this setting. But he was also just not he also just has no experience with soul casting. So why would he know how it works? But because I know from Yasna's chapters in the previous, from Shallan's chapters with Yasna in the previous book, I know how soul casting works roughly. So I know what's happening here, because what's happening is that rock is much denser than air. And so in order to create a wall of rock, you need a much larger amount of air than the amount of air that naturally fills that space. And so air from all around actually gets condensed into the wall of rock, and that's the inward wind. So that was an interesting moment where I it's interesting that Adeline doesn't know that. It makes sense. I'm not saying it's weird that he doesn't know that. I just found it kind of interesting. We also learned that using soulcasters slowly turns you to stone, which, yikes. I hope the surge binding version of soulcasting doesn't do that, because otherwise Shallan is screwed. And so is Yasna, who I still maintain is not dead. Yikes. Let me just see. What else is there for me to talk about in this chapter? Oh yeah, Syl. Was it Syl or Pattern? I think Syl. Syl talks about gender at one point, which is interesting. And the way she talks about it implies that, like spren gender is not an inherent quality. It's a function of human perception, just like everything else about a spren. So Syl is female and does consider herself female, but only because she is seen as such by others. And that's a really interesting, and what's really interesting to me about that is that is a parallel with the Reshi King from the last part of the book, because the Reshi King is male because he is perceived as male because he is king. So either Sanderson is doing some shockingly progressive explorations of gender in this book on purpose, which I doubt, because that doesn't seem like Sanderson to me, or he's doing it by accident, which I would find really interesting. That's the sort of stuff I'd do in my writing, but I'm significantly further left and also queer and also more interested in issues of gender than Brandon Sanderson has appeared so far. So I don't expect that's on purpose, but I do find it really interesting and compelling. What else? Ooh, here's one. So one of the little blurbs there are quotes from the in-universe book Words of Radiance. And they talk about the different kinds of different kinds of, I forgot the word again, the thing Kaladin is, and also Shallan, the what do you call them all? The edge dancers, at light weavers, etc. They're all different kinds of never mind. Different orders of the Knights Radiant, let's say. Anyway, one of the orders of the Knights Radiant that is mentioned in the Words of Radiance is called the Bondsmiths. And what the Words of Radiance says about Bondsmiths is that there were only ever 3 of them, because their spren were different from other spren. Here's a wild theory. I think, based on the name Bondsmith, that the Bondsmiths are the ones who... Surge binding! That's the word I'm looking for. Surge binders. Anyway, I think that Bondsmiths are a kind of surge binder who helps other surge binders bond with their spren. And based purely on the name, since I know nothing else about them. And I'm also guessing that the reason there are only ever 3 of them is because there's one for each god. So, like, there's always a cultivation bondsmith, an honor bondsmith, and an odium bondsmith. We now have confirmation that there are... well, we don't have confirmation, but we have implication that there are honor types of... that there are, like, species of spren associated with honor and species of spren associated with cultivation. Syl is definitely associated with honor. She's literally called an honor spren. Is she called an honor spren? I think she's called an honor spren. And Windle is implied to be associated with cultivation. Maybe was he called cultivation spren explicitly? I can't remember. And that leaves Pattern. Now, Pattern is associated with lies, and my first thought is that that might mean that he's odium spren, like tied to odium. But would he be helping Shallan then? I don't know. I still don't know if odium has its own spren and its own surge binders. Because it has the Parshendi. Is that all odium needs? Does it need, like, human surge binder? I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, that's my theory on why there's only 3 bondsmiths. What else? I don't think there's anything else here. Yeah, I think I'm done actually with this video, and I went over 30 minutes again. You see why I had to make 2 videos out of this? Jesus Christ. Okay, I'm finally gonna get back to reading the book now and go into part 4 and see where this goes. Yeah. Have a nice week. You got a 2-for-1 this week, as it were. See you on Wednesday. Bye.